Hi, boys and girls. This is Ms. Kathy. I'm so happy you've joined me today for another story just for you.
Maria's Wild Animals. Wait a minute, Maria Vargas said. When someone tells you what to do, that's supposed to make you happy? I don't think so, she thought. Mrs. Shue tried to explain. God's laws protect us so we can be happy. That makes sense, Sammy said. I wouldn't be too happy if someone was stealing from me or lying to me. If everyone is obeying God's laws, then everyone can be happy. It's like obeying your parents, Mrs. Shue added. You do what they ask because you love them, because they know what's best for you. Well, maybe, Maria thought. When the class was ending, Mrs. Shue asked, Who volunteered to help me at the meeting tonight? I did, Maria answered. I'll be there. The Mill Valley Church was having special meetings the next week to invite new people to the church. Pastor Hill had asked Mrs. Shue to babysit for the parents who attended the meetings, and Mrs. Shue had asked the shoebox kids to help. Are you ready, Maria? Excuse me, let me do that again. Are you ready, Maria? Mrs. Shue asked when Maria came into the babysitting room that evening. Oh, yes, this will be fun, Maria said. I like little kids. Mrs. Shue smiled. That's good, because sometimes small children can be very difficult to control, especially when there are several of them in the same room. I'm sure I can handle it, Maria replied confidently. Sorry, my voice. Let me do that again. I'm sure I can handle it, Maria replied confidently. Well, I'm glad you're here. Pastor Hill told me that a lot of people are coming tonight. That may mean a lot of kids. Soon, the first child arrived. What's your name? Maria asked, kneeling down in front of her. Ashley. That's a pretty name, Maria smiled. Do you want to play with the toys? 15 minutes later, there were 6 more children in the babysitting room. Alan, Susie, Tyler, Denise, Conrad, and Yo-Yo. Maria sat down beside Mrs. Shue, who was tying Conrad's shoe. It's getting pretty loud in here, Maria said. Mrs. Shue nodded. You'll get used to it. She looked down at Conrad. Now please don't untie your shoe again. Oh no, Maria exclaimed. She jumped up and dodged across the room, trying not to run over anyone. Then she grabbed Susie. Where did you find that pencil, Susie? Give it to me. You shouldn't run with a pencil in your hand. Tyler started hitting Maria on the shoulder. I want a drink. Okay, I'll take you to the drinking fountain, Tyler. On their way to the door, Maria had to step past Susie, who was sitting on the floor, ripping up Sabbath school felts. Susie, what are you doing? Susie held up her felts. It's Daniel. He got chewed up by the lions. But God protected Daniel, Maria pointed out. Tears started forming in Susie's eyes. She put her head down and started crying. I killed Daniel. I killed Daniel. Maria patted her head. No, you didn't. It's all right. I'll come back and help you put Daniel back together. Maria, Mrs. Shue called from the doorway, I have to take Denise to the bathroom. Will you be all right by yourself for a few minutes? Maria nodded. I hope so. Then she remembered Tyler. Oh, I'm sorry. I was going to take you to get a drink, but now I can't until Mrs. Shue gets back. As soon as Mrs. Shue left the room, Conrad started thumping Alan on the head with a stuffed bear. Conrad, Maria said in her stern voice, stop hitting Alan. These kids are driving me crazy, Maria thought. She looked around the room. Yo-Yo was sitting quietly by the cassette player. Maria felt proud of her sister. At least Yo-Yo isn't causing trouble. Then she walked over to where Yo-Yo was playing. What are you doing? She started to ask quietly. Then she saw a pile of shiny brown stuff on the floor. What are you doing? Maria almost shouted. I'm taking stringy stuff out of the tape, Yo-Yo said. But that's the Sabbath school songs tape. Maria took the tape from her hands and then plopped down on the floor. This is a disaster, she thought. These kids are like wild animals, and I don't know what to do. She put her hands on her head. Suddenly, something whacked her on the head. It was Conrad and his bear again. I want a cookie, he shouted. Then they all joined in. I want a cookie. I want a cookie, they shouted. Maria thought her head was going to explode. Then the door opened. Mrs. Shue stepped in and clapped her hands loudly. Children, let's all come and sit down, please. Conrad raced to a chair. Can I have a cookie? He asked sweetly. Snack time is coming, Mrs. Shue answered, but first we'll have a story. Then she turned to Maria. I'll tell them a story while you pick up some of the problem toys. I'm sorry, Maria said. They were getting into everything. Mrs. Shue waved her off. Kids do that. Then she began her story. Maria picked up the pile of tape and set it in a box. Then she put the felts away and put the other toys back on the shelves. Don't you wish you could share your food with Jesus like that boy did? Mrs. Shue finished her story. Conrad nodded. I wish I had some food. Mrs. Shue just smiled. Okay, it's time for our snack. Is anyone hungry? I am, the kids shouted together. Good, Mrs. Shue said. But first we have to talk about 3 rules I want you each to remember. No hitting, share the toys, and don't break the toys. Can you say that? Maria watched while they repeated. No hitting, the children said together. Share the toys, don't break the toys. Okay, snack time. The rest of the time went by quickly. Maria read, sang, played, and smiled until she was exhausted. Finally, the program ended and the kids were gone. You were right, she told Mrs. Shue. Kids are hard to control, but when everyone followed the rules, they all had a good time, even me. Mrs. Shue laughed. That's kind of what we learned in our lesson this morning, isn't it? That God gave us rules so we could be happy? Maria was surprised. I guess it is. I think I learned my lesson a lot better tonight than I did this morning.
The story you have heard today is from the Shoebox Kids Bible Stories, written by Jerry D. Thomas and used with permission from the Pacific Press Publishing Association. If you're interested in any other books published by the Seventh-day Adventist Church, please visit AdventistBookCenter.com or call 1-800-765-6955.
This podcast is a production of the Carolina Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church.